My name is Leah Colby. I am 36 years old. I am standing at the window of my chambers on the fourth floor of the Fairfax County Justice Center, holding a cup of coffee that went cold 40 minutes ago, watching the parking structure across the street fill up with cars for the 9 o'clock docket. Below me, a woman in a cream-colored coat is checking her reflection in the side mirror of a black Mercedes, smoothing something invisible from her lapel. She has no idea yet that she is about to walk into my courtroom. She has no idea who I am at all, actually, which is the whole point of the story and the reason it took 11 months to get here. I did not become a judge to prove anything to my family. I want to say that clearly before I tell you what happened, because everything that follows could sound like it was engineered, like I built a career as a weapon and waited for the right Monday to use it. That is not what happened. What happened is smaller and colder than that, and it started on a Thursday in June, 7 weeks before my brother's wedding, when he called me to tell me not to come. "It's not personal," Mitchell said. Those were his first 4 words, which should tell you everything about what came next. "Don't come to the wedding. My fiancé is a hospital CEO. Having you there would ruin my story." I did not ask him what he meant by my story. I already knew. I had known for 11 years, since the night I told our parents at dinner that I was leaving my corporate litigation job to become a public defender, and my mother set down her fork with a particular care she reserves for disappointment and said, "Well, someone has to do something with their life that doesn't pay." I let that sit. I did not correct her. I have made a career in more ways than one, out of not correcting people who have already decided who I am. But I want to ask you something before I go further, because I think this story travels better with your voice in it. Where are you watching from right now, and what time is it where you are? I ask because in about 400 more words, you're going to meet the version of me my family believed in, and I want you holding on to whatever room you're sitting in when you compare her to who I actually turned out to be. My parents, Greg and Sandra Colby, raised 2 children in a split-level house in Annandale, Virginia, 20 minutes from where I now hear cases 4 days a week. Mitchell was born first 18 months ahead of me, and from the earliest photographs I have seen of us, the ones in the hallway, the ones nobody has ever taken down, he is always in front. Not because anyone posed us that way, because that is where the camera pointed by instinct, and nobody in my family ever seemed to notice they were doing it. He was the fast one, the charming one, the one who got elected to student council in 8th grade on a platform of nothing but likability, and won. I was the quiet one, which in my family was never a compliment. It was a diagnosis. My mother used to tell people at church functions and at the nail salon and once, memorably at my own college graduation, that I was the practical one, God help her, and laugh in a way that made the people around her laugh too, and I would stand there in my cap and gown holding a degree in political science with a 3.94 GPA and understand, again, that being right was never going to be the same thing as being seen. Mitchell went into sales. He was good at it, genuinely good, the kind of good where a room warms up when he walks in and cools down 40 seconds after he leaves. By 26, he was managing a regional territory for a medical device company. By 30, he had a title with the word director in it and a leased BMW he mentioned within the first 10 minutes of any conversation. My parents refer to him, without irony, as the success, a shorthand so worn into the family vocabulary that I once heard my aunt use it to a stranger at a funeral. That's Mitchell. He's the success. And that's Leah. No noun attached. Just my name, left hanging, like a sentence someone forgot to finish. I finished my sentence myself. I went to law school on a full merit scholarship, which nobody in my family ever mentioned at a single holiday gathering in 3 years, though my mother told the entire table, twice, about the used Lexus Mitchell leased in his second year of sales. I clerked for a federal district judge the summer after my second year for $87,400, a number I remember exactly because it was the first year in my life someone paid me to think instead of to be pleasant. I spent 6 years as a public defender in Fairfax County, taking cases nobody wanted, standing next to people my family would have crossed the street to avoid, learning something in those courtrooms that I don't think you can learn any other way, that almost everyone who ends up in front of a judge got there by a smaller, stranger, more human road than the headline suggests, and that the job of paying real attention to that road is a form of respect most people never receive from anyone in their lives. I want to pause here because I think this is the part of the story that explains everything that comes after it, and I don't want to rush past it the way my family always did. My competence was never a secret. It was simply never asked about. There is a particular kind of family cruelty that doesn't require insults. It only requires never once asking the follow-up question. Nobody in my family ever asked what a public defender actually does. Nobody asked what I was reading for the bar, what my trial record looked like, what it meant when I got appointed at 33 as the youngest sitting judge in the history of the Fairfax County Circuit Court. My mother found out from a woman at her book club who had read about it in the county paper and called me not to congratulate me but to ask, with genuine confusion in her voice, "Wait, you're a judge? Since when?" "Since 14 months earlier," is the answer. Since a governor's appointment ceremony my parents did not attend because Mitchell had a client dinner that weekend and someone needed to drive him to the airport. That is the shape of the 11 years. Not one dramatic betrayal. A slow, patient accumulation of small ones, each individually forgettable, each one a brick in a wall neither of my parents ever noticed they were building. By the time Mitchell called me on that Thursday in June, I had stopped expecting the wall to come down. I had simply stopped standing in front of it, which is why, when he told me not to come to his wedding, I felt something close to relief. It is a strange thing to admit, but there is a specific peace that arrives when someone finally says the quiet part out loud, because it means you no longer have to wonder whether you imagined it. "She's marrying into a family," Mitchell went on, when I didn't respond right away. "Brooke's whole thing is precision. Optics. She runs a 400-bed hospital system, Leah. Her board has opinions about everything, including who's in the wedding photos. I told her you had a scheduling thing. A government job." It sounded better than the truth. I did not ask what he had told her the truth was, because I already knew the shape of it. I had heard versions of that sentence at every family event for a decade. "She wouldn't understand the room. She's always been more of a, it's not personal, we just need someone who's been present." My mother was on the call too, on speakerphone from the kitchen. I could hear the specific echo of that room, the one she has had since 1994, and she said nothing. Not one word in my defense, not one word of surprise, not even the practiced diplomacy she usually performs for outsiders. 11 years of silence has a sound, and I have learned to recognize it instantly, the way you recognize a smell from childhood before you've consciously placed it. I let the quiet sit for exactly as long as it needed to. "Okay," I said. That was the whole of it. One word. I did not ask him to reconsider. I did not remind him what I did for a living or what I had done for him. The $2,000 I quietly wired him in 2019 when his commission draw fell through and he was 3 weeks from missing rent. The letter of recommendation I wrote at 1 a.m. for a business school application he never finished. The 4 separate times over 11 years I had shown up for him in ways he had never once had to notice, because noticing would have required imagining that I mattered enough to be a variable in his life at all. I said none of it. I set my phone down on my kitchen counter, and I reached for my coffee instead, and it had gone cold exactly the way it is cold in my hand right now. For weeks later, at this window, watching a woman in a cream coat check her lipstick in a car mirror, without any idea what building she is about to walk into. I want to tell you what happened when she did. But you already know how this genre works. You know there's a reveal coming. What you don't know yet is what my job actually is, and I think you need to sit with that part first because that's the part my family never bothered to. By the time Mitchell got engaged, I had been sitting on the bench for just over 2 years. Circuit court judges in Virginia handle a wide docket. Felony criminal trials, civil suits over $25,000, family law, and, increasingly in my particular courtroom, complex civil matters involving healthcare institutions, because I had spent 4 years before my appointment as a special counsel reviewing regulatory compliance cases for the state bar, a niche specialty almost nobody wants, and almost every hospital system in the region eventually needs a judge who actually understands. It is dense, unglamorous work. It requires reading 500 pages of billing codes and clinical documentation without your eyes sliding off the page. It is, in other words, exactly the kind of competence that never once made it into a conversation at my mother's dinner table because it does not photograph well, and it does not come up naturally in small talk at a nail salon. 4 months before the wedding call, I was assigned a case that had been quietly working its way through pretrial motions for the better part of a year, a consolidated civil action against Ridgeline Regional Health System, brought by a group of former patients and two whistleblower nurses alleging a pattern of falsified surgical documentation across 3 facilities. It was not, by that point, a small matter. Ridgeline's outside counsel had already tried twice to get it reassigned, once on a jurisdictional technicality and once, more quietly, through a motion that made vague reference to judicial impartiality concerns that went nowhere because there was nothing behind it. The case carried a company exposure figure north of $40 million in potential damages and, more immediately relevant to a hospital system that lives and dies on its accreditation, a set of emergency compliance motions that could suspend 2 of its surgical licenses within 30 days if the court found sufficient cause. I did not know, when I was assigned that docket, that Ridgeline's chief executive officer was a woman named Brooke Ashford. I did not know, until roughly 6 weeks later, that Brooke Ashford was engaged to my brother. Those 2 facts sat in separate rooms in my head entirely by accident, the way most of the facts in the story did. Right up until the Monday, everything collided in one hallway. I want to be honest about something here because Laneby stories like this one live or die on whether the reveal feels earned or feels convenient, and I would rather you trust me than be impressed by me. I did not engineer this. I did not know Brooke's face. I did not connect Mitchell's fiancée, the hospital CEO, to the CEO named in the caption of the case on my Monday docket, until the moment her name was called by my clerk and I looked up from my notes and saw, for the first time, the woman my brother had chosen, sitting exactly where every anxious executive sits on the morning their institution's future gets decided by someone they have never met. The 7 weeks between the wedding call and that Monday were, on the surface, unremarkable. I did not call Mitchell to argue. I did not call my mother to demand an apology. I have learned, over 11 years and 1 very expensive law degree, that arguing for your own significance to people who have already decided you don't have any is a losing motion in every court that matters. I filed nothing. I simply continued doing the only thing I had ever actually been doing this whole time, which was my job, carefully on schedule, with the same attention I would have given the case if the CEO named in it had been a stranger, because until that Monday morning, she was. I did send my parents one message, the week before the wedding, RSVPing in writing that I would not be attending, so there would be no ambiguity, no story later about how I had simply chosen not to come. I wanted the record to reflect what had actually happened. Old habits. My mother wrote back 4 words. Understood. We'll explain it. I have thought about that sentence more than almost any other sentence in this entire story, because I still don't know, to this day, what version of an explanation she gave the extended family for why the judge in the room wasn't there. The wedding took place on a Saturday in late July at a vineyard outside Middleburg, 61 miles from my house. I did not attend, obviously, but I heard about it the way you hear about things you were deliberately excluded from, secondhand, from an aunt who assumed I already knew the details, who mentioned offhand that Brooke's board chair had given a toast referencing the extraordinary caliber of people in this family, and that Mitchell had stood up and thanked his parents for always believing in what I could become, and that nobody, not one person at that microphone, had said my name. I did not cry about that. I want to say that plainly because I think there's an expectation in stories like this one that the wound has to be dramatized to be real, and mine wasn't. I felt something quieter and more clarifying, the specific, settled feeling of watching a pattern complete itself exactly the way you predicted it would, with no satisfaction and no surprise, only confirmation. I went back to my case files that Saturday night. I had a hearing in 9 days and $40 million of exposure, doesn't care whose wedding happened that afternoon. The hearing was scheduled for Monday, August 24th, at 9 a.m. in Courtroom 4C. It was the first substantive hearing on Ridgeline's emergency compliance motion, the one that would determine whether 2 of the system's surgical licenses would be administratively suspended pending the outcome of the broader civil action. Ridgeline's general counsel had insisted, over my clerk's objection, that Brooke Ashford appear in person rather than send a deputy, because the board wanted the CEO's face visibly present for what they hoped would read, in the local business press, as accountability. I found that detail almost unbearably ironic, weeks later. Brooke Ashford had walked into my courthouse to perform accountability for a room full of strangers 7 days after standing at a podium and thanking a room full of family for believing in someone who had spent 11 years, making sure I never got to be one of the people who believed in. The morning of the hearing smelled the way the fourth floor of the Justice Center always smells at that hour. Recirculated air, printer toner from the clerk's office down the hall, and the particular cold-brewed bitterness of the coffee machine in chambers that nobody has replaced since I was appointed. I was reviewing the compliance motion for the third time when my clerk, Priya Anand, knocked and told me the bailiff had a scheduling issue. Opposing counsel had asked for a 15-minute delay to consult privately with their client before the hearing began, and could Ms. Ashford wait in an available conference space rather than the public hallway, given the press interest in the case. My chambers were the closest room available. I said that was fine. I had no idea, in that moment, what that logistical accident was about to hand me. The bailiff, a 22-year veteran of the courthouse named Walt Renner, led Brooke Ashford down the private corridor to my chambers at 8:47 that morning. I remember the exact time because it is stamped on the security log, which I later had no reason to pull but did anyway, out of something closer to disbelief than curiosity. I was at my desk when she walked in, wearing the same cream-colored coat I would recognize weeks later from the parking structure the day this all started to make sense to me. She did not look at me first. People rarely do. In that first second in a judge's chambers, they look at the room because the room is doing the talking. And on the wall behind my desk, between my law license and a photograph of my clerkship cohort, hangs a plaque I did not choose to display for anyone's benefit but my own. Forbes 40 Under 40, awarded the year I was appointed, for judicial reform work I had done redesigning the county's pretrial diversion program. I watched her read it. I watched the exact half-second where her eyes moved from the plaque to the nameplate on my desk, Honorable Leah M. Colby, and then, slower, to my face, and I watched 11 years of family mythology collapse in real time behind someone else's eyes, because she had clearly been told, at some point in some form, exactly who I was supposed to be, and none of it had prepared her for this room. She screamed. Not a long scream, a short, sharp, involuntary sound, the kind a person makes when the floor of a story they believed in disappears out from under them mid-sentence. Walt Renner stepped forward instinctively. My clerk appeared in the doorway, and Brooke Ashford stood absolutely still in the middle of my chambers, one hand pressed flat against her collarbone, because for one unguarded second before professional composure caught up with panic, she understood exactly what her fiancé had done, and exactly whose courtroom she was about to stand in. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I did not say anything at all for several seconds, because I have learned that silence, held at the right moment, does more work than any sentence I could construct. I set down my pen instead. Miss Ashford, I said, I believe we have a hearing in 13 minutes. She sat down because there was nowhere else in the room to go, and the next several minutes were some of the strangest of my professional life, though I want to be precise about what actually happened, because the version people imagine, a judge using her chambers to humiliate a defendant, is not what this was, and it would have been an ethics violation if it had been. I said almost nothing personal to her. I confirmed, once, in a flat and procedural voice, that I understood she was engaged to my brother, disclosed that fact for the record, and asked whether Ridgeline's counsel wished to move for recusal given the personal connection. It was the correct thing to do, and I would have done it for any judge in my position in any family with any brother. Brooke Ashford, to her credit, and this matters, because this is not a story where the villain's fiancé turns out to be a villain too, said no. She said, in a voice that had not fully steadied, that she believed I would rule fairly regardless, and that she would rather face the actual facts of a case than delay it further. I respected that answer more than almost anything else that happened that week. The hearing proceeded on schedule. I ruled, 3 days later, based entirely on the compliance record before me, the falsified documentation, the whistleblower testimony, the pattern established across 3 facilities, that Ridgeline Regional Health System would suspend surgical privileges at 2 facilities pending a corrective action plan, and that the broader civil action would proceed to trial. It had nothing to do with my brother. It had everything to do with the documents in front of me, which is the only thing that has ever mattered in that courtroom, on any Monday, for anyone. What happened after the hearing, though, is the part of the story that actually belongs to my family, not to the law, and I think it's the part you're here for. Word travels fast in a family that specializes in appearances. By that Wednesday, my mother had called me twice and left one voicemail, none of which I answered right away, because I did not owe anyone an immediate response to a crisis I had not created. When I finally called back Thursday evening, her first words were not an apology. They were, "Is it true you're the judge on Brooke's case? Mitchell says you did this on purpose." I let that sit for exactly one breath. "I didn't know who she was until she was sitting in my chambers," I said. "I've been on this case for 4 months. Nobody asked." "He's devastated," she said. "The board is asking Brooke uncomfortable questions. This is going to follow them." I reached for the window latch instead of answering right away, a small, useless motion, the kind you make with your hands when your mouth has decided not to. "I imagine it is," I said. "I hope they have good counsel." There was a silence on the line that I recognized instantly because it was the mirror image of the one Mitchell had let sit on speakerphone 7 weeks earlier. This time, though, it wasn't me holding it. It was her. 3 separate things happened over the following 2 weeks that I think of, in retrospect, as the actual cascade of the story. Not one dramatic confrontation, but 3 quieter collapses, each one a piece of the mythology finally meeting a fact it couldn't survive. The first was Ridgeline's board, which convened an emergency session the following Monday and, according to the local business paper, requested additional assurances regarding executive oversight, corporate language for the fact that Brooke's own board had begun asking why their CEO's fiancée's strange sister sat on the case, and whether Brooke had disclosed the relationship early enough. She had. The record showed it clearly because I had put it there myself in the hearing transcript. But the appearance of it cost her 3 uncomfortable weeks of scrutiny that had nothing to do with anything I had done, and everything to do with a story Mitchell had told at a rehearsal dinner about a sister who wouldn't have understood the room. The second was smaller, and it was the one that actually reached me directly. Mitchell called 9 days after the hearing, and for the first time in 11 years, he did not lead with charm. "You could have told me," he said, "before the wedding. You knew who she was months before I did." "I didn't," I said. "I found out the same morning she did." "That's not," he started and stopped because there was nothing true on the other side of that sentence for him to finish. He had spent 7 weeks explaining to a room full of relatives why his sister wasn't at his wedding, and the explanation he had chosen, that I would have ruined his story, had turned out, entirely without my intervention, to be the exact opposite of true. I had not ruined anything. I had simply done my job in a room he had never once asked me about, and the job had turned out to be bigger than the joke he'd made of it. The third collapse was the quietest, and it belonged to my mother. She came to my apartment unannounced on a Sunday in early September, 6 weeks after everything, and stood in my doorway with an expression I had genuinely never seen on her before. Not defensive, not performing anything for an audience, because for once there wasn't one. "I didn't know," she said, "about the case. About any of it. I didn't know what you actually did all day." "You never asked," I said. It was not an accusation. It was simply the plainest true sentence I had. She didn't argue with it. That, more than anything else that happened in this whole story, is the detail I keep coming back to. 11 years of not asking, and when it finally came due, she didn't try to explain it away. She just stood there, in a doorway, absorbing the specific weight of a question she had never once thought to ask her own daughter. My colleague Priya, who has clerked for me for 2 years and watched this entire story unfold from the doorway of my chambers, said something to me the following week that I think about more than I expected to. "Your family built their whole understanding of you," she said, "on a picture that stopped being accurate a long time before anyone noticed." I did not correct her. I have never heard it put more precisely. There is one more image from that autumn I want to leave you with, because it is the one that actually closes the story for me, more than the hearing ever did. In early October, my mother asked, for the first time in my career, if she could come see my courtroom, not a hearing, just the room itself, on a quiet afternoon when nothing was on the docket. I said yes. She stood in the doorway of "Foresee the Way Strangers Do," taking in the height of the ceiling, the seal above the bench, the long silence of a room built for exactly one voice at a time to matter. Then she asked to see my chambers, and she stood in front of the Forbes plaque for a long time, longer than Brooke Ashford ever had, and she did not say anything about being proud because I think she understood, finally, that pride offered 11 years late is its own kind of apology, and she let the room say it instead. I keep that image instead of a fantasy of revenge, because it is the truer ending. Not a scene where my family groveled. A quiet Tuesday where my mother finally looked at the actual walls of my life instead of the story she had told herself about them. I still see my parents. I want to be clear about that because this is not a story about burning a family down. It's a story about a wall finally getting looked at directly by people who spent 11 years walking past it without turning their heads. My mother has asked me, twice now, real questions about my actual work. Not performance questions, not the kind she asks to have an answer ready for her book club, but the kind that sit and wait for a real response. Mitchell and I have spoken once since the wedding, briefly, and it was not a reconciliation so much as a quiet accounting of the facts, the way most true endings in families actually are, not a scene, just a settling. I think about the version of me that existed in my family's imagination for 11 years, the practical one, the disappointment, the one who wouldn't understand the room, and I think about her the way you think about a photograph someone else took of you at a bad angle, in bad light, and then framed and hung on their wall as though it were the only picture that existed. It wasn't cruelty, most of it. It was laziness dressed up as certainty. It is so much easier to keep believing an old picture of someone than to update it, especially when the update would require admitting you'd had the wrong one hanging for over a decade. I want to tell you something, and I mean this for you specifically, whoever you are, wherever you're watching from tonight. Setting a boundary is not cruelty. It is information. When I said, okay, on that phone call in June, I was not being passive and I was not being weak. I was declining, quietly, to spend one more ounce of my energy arguing for my own significance to people who had already decided the verdict. That is not surrender. That is the most economical form of self-respect there is. You can love people who have consistently misunderstood you and still refuse to keep shrinking yourself back down to the size of their old assumptions. Love was never supposed to be a blank check written against your own worth, and the people who taught you it was owed you better math than that. The people who actually take the time to see you before you've won an award, before there's a plaque on a wall, before the algorithm of your life has produced anything impressive enough to force their attention. Those people are your family in every way that matters, whether or not you share a surname with them. Biology gave me a brother. It never once obligated me to be unseen by him. Walking away from the role someone has assigned you in their story is not bitterness. It is the only rational response to finally understanding you were cast as a supporting character in a narrative you never agreed to be part of. I did not walk away from my family. I walked away from a part they had written for me without my consent, and I kept walking until the part stopped fitting. And the quiet that has settled into my life since that Monday, the mornings when nobody is comparing me to anyone, ranking me against anyone, deciding out loud what I'm worth over breakfast, that quiet is not emptiness. It is what peace was supposed to feel like the entire time, and I only recognized it once I finally stopped waiting for someone else to hand it to me. I want to know something from you, honestly. If you had been sitting at that dinner table 11 years ago, when a mother set down her fork and called her daughter the practical one, God help her, would you have said something? Or would you have understood, the way I did, that some rooms only change when you stop needing them to? Mitchell said my life was a joke because it had never once been explained to him, and I don't think he ever imagined that not being explained would end up being the very thing that protected it. Right up until the morning a fiancé in a cream-colored coat walked into a courtroom and finally understood what nobody in my family had ever bothered to ask. The story you just heard was inspired by real experiences shared on public platforms including Reddit and other online communities. It has been thoughtfully adapted and reimagined for storytelling purposes. All characters, situations, names, and settings are fictional, altered, or generated using AI tools. Any resemblance to real individuals or events is entirely coincidental and unintentional. This story was created to deliver positive messages, emotional insight, and meaningful reflection, not to represent or defame any real person or situation.